So today we're going to go over the top 10 best weapons to use at level 1 in Elden Ring. I've had plenty of people reach out to me asking for tips on how to complete a level 1 run. So that's what this video is for basically. Just giving you guys a bunch of recommendations to basically just help you complete the challenge run. I know some people just don't want to use the exact same weapons as everybody else, so I'm just going to recommend a whole bunch of different ones. And hopefully you find something that you like. Now the most important things to use in a level 1 run will be the stat boosting tears, the stat boosting talismans, a golden vow dagger, and the ritual shield talisman. These are like must-haves for a level 1 run. Everything else is basically optional. But yeah, with that out of the way, let's just get into it. At number 10, we have the Uchi Katana. Now, katanas themselves are an amazing weapon class. They get really fast movesets. They don't really cost as much stamina. They're very quick, meaning they're actually not that risky. They also get passive bleed, which bleed is amazing to have in the game in general, but it's especially good in a level 1 run because your damage isn't going to be that good, and the damage of status effects don't actually scale with anything. They're just going to do a flat amount of damage every single time, which for bleed is going to be 20% or 10% against bosses. Now, the Uchi Katana is especially good at level 1 because it does not have that high of a requirement, only 11 strength and 15 dexterity, which equipping the Radagon Sword Seal, which you should be using in almost every single level 1 run, is going to help you meet the minimum requirements. So even if you actually had a boss fight that lasted longer than 3 minutes, to where the crystal tears effect actually do wear off, you're still going to be doing respectable damage. Now outside of status effect, poise breaking and stance breaking is just really good, of which the katana can also do that very well. The unsheathed weapon skill, it comes out really fast, it's incredibly cheap, which is obviously good to have in a level 1 run because you're not going to be having much mind, does amazing damage, and better yet, this does really good stance damage. The heavy attack actually does 30 stance damage, and you can actually cancel the recovery animations with a crouch, so you can just keep spamming it over and over again, and you can stance break enemies really quickly. Now yes, I think the Nagakibo is actually going to be a better weapon in general, because it does have much more range for actually not much less damage, but being that that one has much higher requirements, it's not really as easy to get to with a level 1 character. I think the Uchi Katana is going to be better in this instance. Number 9, we have the Bloodhound's Fang, which this is going to be one of the best weapons in general, and this is going to be a really good level 1 weapon as well. You get it right at the beginning of the game, and it can carry you from start to finish. It's a curved greatsword, of which this weapon class is amazing. It gets really good stance damage, really quick attacks, really quick heavy and running attacks too. The Bloodhound Fang in particular just gets bonus damage on jumping attacks compared to all of the other curved greatswords. Also gets some of the highest base damage, it gets passive bleed, and it can be buffed, meaning that you actually can pair it alongside the Blood Flame Blade spell, and you could have amazing bleed output. But arguably the best thing about this weapon is going to be its skill, Bloodhound's Finesse, which this thing does amazing damage even at level 1, and honestly doesn't cost much FP, it does a decent amount of stance damage, and you do get an inherent iframe dodge with the follow-up attack, which this can actually save you a lot more times than you think. Now the only downside of the Bloodhound's Fang is that it is going to have to be used with certain types of stat boosting things. It can just be two-handed when you have the Radagon Sword still equipped, but you are going to need 2 dexterity on top of that, which thankfully there are plenty of sources of what you can use, like the Dexterity Talisman, one of the helmets that boost dexterity, or even the Dexterity tier. And with how much damage this is doing, no boss fight is really going to be lasting longer than 3 minutes, so the Dexterity tier is going to be a perfectly fine option. Number 8, we have the Lordsworn Straight Sword, which straight swords are another easy to use weapon class, really quick attacks. They don't really require much skill, you get good variety in moveset with horizontal, vertical, and poking attacks. It does get the option of Square Off, which Square Off heavy attack does 40 stance damage for only consuming like 8 or 10 FP, which is like next to nothing, which makes it very beneficial in a level 1 run. Now for the Lordsworn Straight Sword in particular, I'm going to value this one the most because it does actually have the highest amount of base damage, which obviously that's going to be the most important thing to have in a level 1 run. So when going into an elemental infusion, which is what I recommend, it is going to be doing much more damage than all of the other straight swords, and it also does get 110 crits as well, which that's obviously going to pair very nicely with the high stance damage that Square Off does get. And having physical infusions just make critical attacks do more damage than having a regular standard infusion. These attacks kind of just bypass the negative effects that split damage just gets inherently, and pairing this alongside the Dagger Talisman can just result in really high amounts of damage. In the gameplay you're seeing here, I just had it cold infused, obviously just proc status effects, which are really powerful. But if you did really want to optimize this, probably going with a lightning infusion might be better because a lot more enemies are weaker to lightning. And if you did want to proc frost, you could just throw Chilling Mist onto a dagger, use it at the start of the boss fight, and then switch back to your main primary weapon, and you could just benefit off that 20% damage debuff that have been inflicted on the enemy. But the best part of the weapon is that it has only a 10 strength and dexterity requirements, meaning that you don't need any single type of stat boosting talismans at all. You can use it one-handed, two-handed, without anything. Number 7, we have the Venomous Fang, which is probably my personal favorite option on this list. It is extremely versatile. To start off with, it only gets a 9 strength and dexterity requirements, meaning that you don't need any types of stat boosting talismans or crystal tears just to actually meet the minimum requirements. It is a claw, so actually can output amazing DPS. Those attacks come out really fast, and you can just R1 spam a lot of enemies to death, and pairing these alongside the multi-hit talismans, it can honestly make it seem that you're actually not even doing level 1 types of damage. Especially because this is a weapon that gets passive poison buildup. But it's not just any poison buildup, it's actually deadly poison, which is like a much more effective version of regular poison. It's like twice as effective, and it does only last 30 seconds as well, which is a perfect pairing alongside the things that do boost your damage every single time you do proc poison, like your Kindred Aura Exaltation or the Mushroom Crown. These buffs do last 20 seconds, so by the time the poison actually wears off, you can just proc it again to just end up getting about 30% more damage. But this weapon also can be infused as well, so you can go ahead and throw in Cragblade and make it bleed infused, and pair this alongside something like the Lord of Blood Exaltation, and you're just doing monstrous damage. And you can just spec into this like R1 spamming build or even just a charged heavy attack build, because something like Cragblade can just help you just stance break even quicker. So yeah, I think this is just a very fun weapon to use. Number 6, I'm going to go with the Bandit's Curve Sword, or really just like any curve sword, just like power stance and curve swords are just always going to be good. And that is especially true on a level 1 run as well. Honestly, just find any single types of curve swords that can be equipped at lower levels with at least using the Radagon Sword Seal. Go put Flaming Strike on either weapon to just help buff the weapon with even more damage, because obviously flat damage buffs are just going to be very beneficial to have at these low level runs. If you are going up against enemies that are resist to fire damage, I would recommend just going with Lightning Slash instead. Go throw in your jumping attack boosting things, your multi-hit talismans, your elemental tears, and just go hard. Just keep spamming those jumping attacks, and everything is just going to be melted. It doesn't even matter. You wouldn't even notice that you're doing a level 1 run with how easy some of these bosses can actually end up being. Number 5, we have the Serpent Hunter, which is going to be definitely one of the more popular options at a level 1 type of run, because it doesn't actually have any requirements at all, which obviously is extremely rare to have with a very large weapon that can do some very nice amounts of stance damage. And the best thing about the Serpent Hunter, outside of the fact that it has no requirements, is going to be its moveset. It just gets the best moveset in the entire game, in my opinion. The light attack is just a bunch of poking attacks, which piercing damage is probably the best damage type in the entire game. The jumping heavy actually has much more range than all of the other great speed jumping heavy attacks. It also gets the rolling and crouching poke attack, which is like a lot faster and a lot quicker than all of the other rolling attacks that the great speeds get. And its heavy attack is going to be a horizontal swipe, which is very good for hit detection if you go up against enemies that do like to move around a whole bunch. And the follow-up attack comes out incredibly quick, so going into a charged heavy attack build can not only result in high amounts of stance damage, but just high amounts of damage in general. And the good thing about charged heavy attack builds is that they're so easy to build around. You get the Spiked Crack Tier and the Axe Talisman basically right at the beginning of the game. Now for me, the major downsides of the Serpent Hunter will be one, that you do acquire it later in the playthrough at the Rykard boss arena, which obviously is going to require you killing at least the Godskin Noble. And there is going to be other weapons that you will end up seeing on this list that just perform better with a charged heavy attack build, and they're also easier to acquire as well. Number 4, we have the Zamora Curved Sword, which this actually might surprise a lot of people, because honestly, who uses this weapon? Nobody. It gets the worst range in class. The light attack combos are just beyond horrendous. That just have terrible hit detection. They're really slow. They don't even lunge very far. But the best part about the weapon is going to be its skill, Zamora Ice Storm. This thing is honestly amazing. There's probably only like one other skill in the game that probably procs Frost faster than this one, which is probably going to be the Death's Poker. Because basically as soon as enemies walk inside of this AoE, it's probably going to just instantly proc them, because the entire storm does a total of 630 Frost buildup, and it also does 40 stance damage, which that's just as much as a Colossal Sword using Lion's Claw. And the fact that you're actually proccing Frost in the meantime, stun locking these smaller enemies, in a pretty quick animation that you can roll out of basically straight away for only 15 FP. Now typically skills like this actually scale off a particular stat, of which when speccing into that stat is going to result in much more damage. But the thing is, with Zamora Ice Storm, it actually doesn't scale with anything. All you have to do is level up the weapon to just maximize its damage. Because this weapon actually doesn't get an intelligence scaling, there's actually no way to really improve the damage of the weapon skill, obviously outside of using things like the Magic Tier or Alexander's Shard. Now there are still going to be a couple of downsides to this weapon. One, it is acquired later in the playthrough in the mountaintop of the Giants, so you're only really going to be using this thing for like the second half of the playthrough. And it also does get somewhat higher dexterity requirements, to which you're basically always going to have the dexterity tier on, or the dexterity talisman, because it does have an 18 dexterity requirement. But honestly, if you haven't used this weapon before, I recommend that you do. Number 3, the Death's Poker, which is like an S tier weapon in this game, and it's going to be an S tier option for level 1 as well. It's a weapon that you actually can get pretty early on. Doesn't actually have that high of requirements, although 17 dexterity and 11 intelligence will have you at least using some types of different helmets, talismans, and crystal tiers just to meet the requirements. But it definitely is worth it, because the weapon does amazing damage, does passive frost, which obviously status effects are really good to have, And the weapon skill is just out of this world. Ghost Flame Ignition is incredibly cheap and it procs Frost faster than anything else in the entire game. The gameplay pretty much just speaks for itself. You can just spam the skill the entire time. One thing I actually don't have equipped is the Spellblade set. Having this equipped does just boost the damage by an additional 8%. So I honestly can be doing even more damage in this build. But yeah, I don't really think I gotta talk about the Death's Poker that much. I think you guys should know about it already. Number 2, we have the Wing of Estelle, which is another S2 weapon, and I'm going to value this one being an amazing level 1 option too. Now the two things of which I have been talking about throughout this entire list are weapons that have really amazing skills, or weapons that actually have really good heavy attacks, of which when speccing into a charged heavy attack build, it's just going to make it do really good damage, of which the Wing of Estelle can do both of those things. You can spec into either one, and it could just work. Now the reason why heavy attack builds are probably especially good at level 1 is because they don't consume any types of FP, and obviously at level 1, every single time that you do get hit, you're probably going to have to heal, so you do want to stock up on a lot of healing flasks, and obviously you're at level 1, you're not going to have much mind, you're not going to have much FP at all. So that's probably why these heavy attack builds are really good, and the reason why the Wing of Estelle heavy attack is amazing is not only that it's a projectile attack, and not only can it do really good damage, but it also just gets some of the highest stance damage in the entire game. It does 52 stance damage, which that's just as much as a colossal weapon. But even with that additional FP that you do have to spare, you can just go spam the skill as well, which Nebula for 20 FP does a really high damaging attack that just does even more stance damage than the heavy attack somehow. Like if all those projectiles hit, you could do upwards of 60 stance damage and just constantly stun lock these enemies too. So just using the combo of the weapon skill and charged heavy attack can basically just stance break almost every enemy in the entire game. Of which getting the riposte is going to be really good, especially with a split damaging weapon like the Wing of Estelle is. And also this weapon is a curve sword, so it's like very quick, it's very light, doesn't consume much stamina, it's very easy to use, all things that are very beneficial to have at lower levels. Now there are still going to be a couple of downsides. One, you don't really get it that early in the playthrough. You still can get it somewhat early, you just gotta kill a couple of bosses. And you basically always have to have the intelligence tier equipped because it does have a 20 intelligence requirement. It also does get 17 dexterity, but when using something like the Radagon Saw Seal and a dexterity boosting helmet, you can just meet those minimum requirements, of which the other crystal tier spot could just go into magic tier instead. Of which no boss fight is going to be lasting longer than 3 minutes anyway, so you don't have to worry about the crystal tier running out because you're doing that much damage. Number 1, the Iron Balls or the Starfist both work just as well. Obviously the Starfist is going to be a little bit better because it does get to bleed and it's a bit more base damage, but that one is acquired later into the playthrough. So when you do acquire it, you can just switch. But the reason why these are just the best weapons to use in a level 1 run, and are just some of the best weapons in general, is because they just have the best charged heavy attacks in the entire game. Of which, as I've mentioned, charged heavy attack builds are just going to be king in level 1 runs because they don't consume any FP. The buffs are what you need to boost these charged heavy attack builds, like Axe Talisman, Spiked Crack Tier, even Cragblade, all of these things are required very early on in the game. And in putting this setup on any type of weapon could just make the entire game really easy. But the reason why the Starfist and Iron Balls just do it better than everything else is because their charged heavy attack is so fast. The charged heavy attack is faster than most other regular uncharged heavy attacks that some of these other weapons get. And it does upwards of 30 stance damage. I think it does roughly 33 stance damage with every single charged heavy, which when paired with Cragblade is going to be doing over 36 stance damage, which is like roughly just as much as a Colossal Sword heavy attack, but you're doing it in like a third of the time. And if you're using something like the Starfist, you're also proccing bleed in the meantime too. And being that you're power stancing and hitting multiple times at once with 2 different weapons, you can also pair it alongside the multi-hit talismans, which is going to further enhance your damage. So this thing could just be built so many different ways. It's so incredibly versatile. And best of all yet, it just has very low requirements. You only really need to have the Radagon Saw Seal equipped, and that is it. You don't need any other types of stat investment. Now the only downside that I can say about these weapons is that they have really bad range. There's going to be plenty of instances of which you just miss. Doesn't matter how close you are to an enemy sometimes, these things have that bad a range that it could just whiff a whole bunch. But that is a small price to pay to just absolutely amazing damage and amazing stance damage. Anyway, that's the video now completed and done. Let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below, and please do like and subscribe because I do have a lot more videos coming out along the way. And also do follow me on Twitch because I am live there every day doing a bunch of random challenge runs. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye!